The other day I finished reading Stephanie Garber's Once Upon a Broken Heart series, and I, along with seemingly every other reader, was pretty disappointed. And it always feels really like, I don't know, presumptuous and like high and mighty to make these videos that are like, I know what went wrong, when in actuality, you know, a lot of different things went wrong, but I am especially interested in desire and how desire works in romance books. So I want to go into like why in that aspect the third book really failed what the first two books set up. And in order for me to go into all of these things, like, I do need to spoil the whole series, but I don't go into that much detail. And more importantly, because the framework that I'm trying to get across in terms of desire and how it works in romance books is quite general, I think even if you haven't read the series, you can like be on the same page as me here. First, I'm going to explain what exactly it is that I mean when I talk about desire. Then I talk about the importance of desire in Garber's series specifically, and then I use all of those things as a jumping board to explain why the third book was such a failure. Desire is a lack. That's what Anne Carson writes. We're going to be using a little bit of Anne Carson, and then we can kind of leave the academics behind. She writes that which is known, attained, possessed, cannot be an object of desire. You can't want something that you already have, obviously. She also writes that before love is fulfilled, the lover's only delight is in reaching across the space of desire. And what I mean by that space is that it's in the difference between the real Vronsky and the imagined one, between an actual knight and an empty suit of armor that desire is felt. Across this space, a spark of eros moves in the lover's mind to activate delight. Delight is a movement of the soul in Aristotle's definition. So more precisely, before love is fulfilled for the lover, the only delight is in reaching across that space of desire towards the thing or the object that they desire. And I love this idea. I love conceptualizing desire as a constant movement, as a constant reaching across a space. And desire can only be sustained by absence. And as soon as a union happens, as soon as you get the thing you want, desire completely collapses. That space between two things is desire, and that desire causes a movement. So if we imagine desire as a movement, then we can see that in Stephanie Garber's Once Upon a Broken Heart series, the driving force of desire, the delight of movement towards the beloved object, is the force that fuels Stephanie Garber's writing. Where other authors would rely on plot, I believe the engine of the narrative is desire. This constant reaching constitutes the narrative heart of Stephanie Garber's writing. And these books, much like her Caraval series, are dreamlike and they meander, and if you read the one-star reviews on Goodreads, then you will see that the biggest problem a lot of people have with them is that they have no plot. I would argue that the difference between people who hate the series and love the series are the people who are reading it for plot and then hate it because there is no real plot, and the people who love it because they are desperately waiting for Evangeline and Jax to get together. That's that driving force of desire I was talking about. And the reason I would say that desire is a driving force in this series, unlike in any other series I've really come across, is because it's like the whole reason it was written. I mean, Jax was in the Caraval series, and people were pretty obsessed with him then, as far as I can gather. But then obviously his romantic plotline in that series doesn't work out, so he gets this whole other series devoted basically just to him. So what that means is that the whole reason this like spin-off series exists is because there's so much unfulfilled desire for Jax. People don't just want to know his backstory, or they don't just want to know how his story continues. In actuality, readers really just want Jax. So what fuels the whole series is this desire for Jax, and then that desire morphs from readers wanting to see a successful union between him and Donatella to simply wanting to see a union between him and Evangeline. Because what everyone is basically just interested in is seeing them together, we can forgive that Evangeline is very naive. We can forgive this dreamlike weird plot that we're wading through and where problems resolve themselves very conveniently, because that's not actually what it's about. It's all just a backdrop for this story about two people who we feel are meant to be together and aren't. And you can see this very clearly in, for example, the second book, which I've heard a lot of people say is the best book in the series. But when I think about it, what really sticks out to me is that there's this whole what feels like a very long section of the book where all that happens is that Jax and Evangeline are trapped together in this like inn, and the plot comes to a crashing halt, but it's forgiven because what we're reading it for is the interactions between them, not whatever semblance of plot that Stephanie Garber is trying to sell us on. Perhaps more importantly, this sort of strange dream-like plot actually works in tandem with the central thing she's writing about, which is desire, because for example, Catherine Belsey, who has written a whole book about desire, which is amazing, I'm reading it right now, is that she focuses on desire's unpredictability and its indifference to temporal regularity. Desire is a strange, uncontrollable thing. It defies logic, it defies narrative, so that's why it almost makes more sense for this series to defy a true plot and simply go with the ebbs and flows of desire instead. Belsey also writes that, too often, in my view, commentators on romance isolate the content of the story and look for explanations at the level of the signified, supposing that a satisfying resolution of the plot is the element that ensures a satisfied reader. What they neglect in the process is the pleasure of reading itself. And I think Garber is highly aware of this, and I think Garber continuously draws out the union between Evangeline and Jax because she understands that it's more about this process of reading and the pleasure you derive from that rather than the actual A to B to Z to happy end. And I think that is why in this book, more so than in any other young adult novel I've ever read, she is constantly playing with physical desire as well. Unfulfilled physical desire is literally the entire foundation of Jax's characters. If he kisses someone, they die. He is continuously out of the reach of the reader, or rather out of the hands of his potential love interest, and this forbidden element, this thing that continuously pushes away other people, this is then what fuels more and more unfulfilled desire. It's like kind of genius, to be honest. Because he cannot kiss anyone for so much of the series, him and his love interest are excluded from the traditional hallmark of a successful union between lovers, a kiss. And this is especially important in a YA novel where sex is mostly absent. And once we sort of like start looking for desire, we realize that in these books it's absolutely everywhere. Like I said, Jax as a fate is constantly battling his desire to find his true love, but he can't because anyone he kisses will die. The other fate, Lala, is constantly fighting her desire to get married, even though she knows she never can. Apollo is first cursed to want nothing more than to marry Evangeline, and then is cursed to want nothing more than to kill her. His desires are also sort of going array. And then vampires are thrown into the mix, and there's obviously lots of aspects of carnal desires that kind of brings with it. So these aspects of desire are fundamental to the macro level of the plot and characterization, but as we read on the micro level of the prose, desire is also everywhere. There are lots of examples for this. There's countless ones with Luke and Evangeline and Apollo and Evangeline and all the vampires, and all of it is very much focused on carnal desire in Evangeline's body, which is very strange considering that, like I said, she is a very naive, juvenile, fairy tale-esque feeling character, and sex is completely absent in these books, but so much focus lies on her body. So I'm gonna give a couple of examples with Jax specifically because that's what we're all here for. But just know it's everywhere. And like, it's so weird because for a YA novel, I should not be feeling embarrassed to be reading these aloud, but I am. Like, this is book one, bearing in mind. Evangeline could feel Jack's inhuman gaze sliding over her skin, making her blood rush as his eyes raked over every silver line, wrapping tightly around her hips, her waist, her chest. He stopped, gaze drifting off before meeting her eyes. So it's weird, isn't it weird? It's a little bit weird. It's interesting. So she's using all these like verbs like gliding and raked, and all he's doing is looking at her, but she's making these verbs kind of like physical. Like, it's very, you know, the sexual tension here is not subtle at all. And she's kind of like dissecting the female body and the hips and the waist and the chest, and she's not telling us like Jax is looking at her titties, but like she basically is. And then we've got lots of examples when Jax has had vampire venom and all the carnal desire becoming very obvious, like, I don't want to be a vampire, but I do want to bite you, and penetration, and you know, we all know this. Yeah, his mouth curved wider as his hands moved from her throat to her shoulders and slowly slid the cape away, leaving more of her skin exposed. His fingers drifted lower, trailing down her chest to the sensitive stretch of skin right above the lacy line of her corset. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with these passages, obviously, But what makes them stand out to me is that they appear way more frequently than they do in a lot of other comparable YA romance books. But when they do appear, they are extremely, they're not graphic, but they're very, very visceral. They're all about the body. They're all about physical desire. I think because, yeah. And then in the second book, we get even more explicit. Desire is constantly being amped up, even though no kind of romantic union happens, where it's sort of, as we're decreasing the space between the lovers, as we're kind of getting them to be as close as possible to each other without actually fucking, that's where sort of that tension arrives. That's the thing that makes us keep reading. And because she continuously drives her characters in these situations, desire is amped up and amped up and amped up, and you keep reading and reading and reading, but because it's never fulfilled, you also kind of don't lose interest, at least for the first 2 books. Book 2 then becomes even more explicit. He took a slow bite of fruit, eyes darkening as they slowly slid from her lips to her neck, following the exposed line of it down to her clavicle and then to her breasts. Then slowly Jackson curled his fingers from her, but not before she felt his knuckles softly brush against the underside of her breast. Then they're kissing and Jax's mouth kicked up as if he knew what she'd been thinking, and then his gaze plunged lower, moving from her lips to her neck until it rested on the sweat of her breasts where her heart was suddenly pounding. Like, out of context, don't these read like Harlequin romances from the 90s? Then he cops another feel of her breasts when he's changing the bandages on her, like, back. It's like every innocuous situation between the two is just the horniest thing in the world. But Stephanie Garber knows exactly what she's doing with desire, and she knows that if it's fulfilled, we lose interest. I think the reason Stephanie Garber is so aware of what she's doing with desire is particularly clear in this passage in book 3, which is very much like the ones I just described, you know, ragged breathing, guiding her onto the bed. He carefully undid the clasps that held the piece down over her hips, leaving her in nothing but a silverish knee, arms spinning, and then Evangeline pressed her hands down against Jax, guiding him to lie down, to let her be the one to touch him. As she started with his doublet, which she still hadn't taken off, she slid her hand under the damp fabric, ready to take it off him, and that's when she felt it. Her fingers brushed against a slip of paper. So, what we have is obviously a scene. Like, I don't even know how to analyze this, okay? But I think what's happening here is that she's literally getting you all excited, and she's like, Evangeline is gonna touch Jax, and then when she brushes up against what the reader is, I think, meant to think is his, like, raging boner, is actually a slip of paper that then completely ruins this whole scene, and again defers a union, because it's the letter that Evangeline wrote to herself in, like, the second book, where she's like, here's all the reasons why you can't trust Jax. Like, Stephanie Garber is purposely playing with the reader, like, right? And I think I wasn't the only one who noticed this. I think I saw a lot of people talking about that chapter that ends like this at the inn, which has a sign that contained the word vacancy, and then hooked beneath that was an even smaller sign that read, 1 bed. You can't tell me that this author does not know what this is going to do to all the people who ship, like, this couple. Like, people were losing their minds, and then they don't even share the bed. They don't even share the bed. And it's not like she couldn't write about sex if she really wanted to, just because it's YA. I mean, that's never stopped Sarah J. Maas. That's never stopped other authors from writing around it using euphemisms. She's deliberately not giving readers a sexual union because then we would lose interest. And, like, paradoxically, I think it almost makes readers a little bit crazier reading all of these things in YA, because she can't really give us that payoff that you would expect in a new adult series, for example. Meaning that readers are kind of left hanging in this space of desire that's just not fulfilled. And even when Jax and Evangeline have their happy ending or whatever, Stephanie Garber is still not willing to give up all desire. She's still not willing to kind of give her readers everything they want, not just in terms of, like, physical desire, but also, like, the whole reason they started reading the series in the first place, which was to find out more about Jax. And she makes a joke about it right at the end when Evangeline goes, tell me about the apples, and Jax just goes, next question. I've seen people speculate, or maybe it's even confirmed, that she's going to write more books in this universe. So this is just another way that she knows she can get readers to read the next series because for like 6 books she's like dangled this question over our heads, how, like, why is he always eating these stupid apples, and she still isn't giving us that answer, because then we have to buy another book. I didn't expect to get so heated talking about this, but it's actually making me quite annoyed, because, like, find a new character, write about a new couple, write about a new world, find other ways to play with desire if that's all you seem to want to do. But let's get back on track to why the 3rd book specifically flopped and why this kind of house of cards of desire seems to sort of collapse. By the end of book 2, we know that Jax has gone back in time to save Evangeline and has given up his like true love Donatella, and we also know that Evangeline realizes she is in love with him and she wants to tell him, but she simply runs out of time. All that the reader is now sort of waiting for is for them to confess their love for each other. So desire is still there, but desire is like partially fulfilled, you know? We're no longer sort of playing this guessing game. But Garber doesn't sort of submit to this union. She doesn't kind of let the characters give in to what the reader already knows, and instead she, in the whole of the 3rd book, is straining to artificially keep them apart. And instead of relying on unfulfilled desire, what she's relying on is plot. And what's happening here is sort of like a normal obstacle that romance heavy books tend to face. And I think a helpful parallel here is the Cruel Prince series, which if you haven't read, skip to this timestamp. But I think it's useful here because readers also tend to find that the 3rd book isn't as compelling as the first 2. And I believe partly why that is because Jude and Carden are in the same position where the reader knows they love each other, but they haven't told each other. And that obviously is a lot less compelling than the like dagger to your throat, like I hate you but I love you kind of thrill. But the reason that the book or the series doesn't suffer as much as Stephanie Garber's series is because romance isn't the narrative engine of the series in the way that Garber's is. So what the Cruel Prince series is about fundamentally is Jude's desire for power and Jude trying to find a space for herself in like Fae world or whatever. So even if the romance is completely taken out of that, there's still a compelling reason to keep reading. But because Stephanie Garber has kind of put all of her eggs in one desire basket, once Jax and Evangeline are already in love with each other, there is just no compelling reason to really keep going. Since desire is sort of more about the journey than the destination, it's all about the friends we made along the way, or as Belsey writes, it's about the actual pleasure of reading rather than the conclusion. Book 3 just doesn't work because you don't get the same kind of pleasure in reading when it's not about like interpreting both characters' actions and kind of playing this guessing game of will they, won't they, because you know they will, you're just sort of trying to figure out how. And the how is the really big problem here because it's no longer the characters sort of like not being ready to be together. The thing that's keeping them apart is plot. And even if you love Stephanie Garber's writing, you have to just admit that plot is not her strong suit. I'm not going to go into all the plot holes that the series has, that's what Reddit is for, but just know that they are there. What I instead want to focus on is one major aspect of the plot that kind of ruins everything in terms of desire for the reader, because Evangeline has lost all of her memories, and what this means is that the reader can no longer identify with her. Because I think if you're, you know, the average heterosexual female reader, what you're trying to do is to live vicariously through Evangeline to sort of receive the secondhand gratification of what a union with Jax is like. But this immersion is completely destroyed once we know everything about the lost year that Evangeline doesn't, because all of a sudden we're relegated to the role of the spectator rather than someone who's experiencing the story through Evangeline. And Catherine Belsey has a great line where she writes that, "Described from a distance, desire retains all of its absurdity and none of its charm." And that is exactly what this book feels like. We reach a stage with Stephanie Garber's writing where we're fed up because it's no longer a sort of masochistically pleasurable, drawn out, unfulfilled desire thing. It's just straight up painful and annoying. And we just know that if Stephanie Garber wanted to, she would, and she's simply choosing not to. I almost have to feel bad for Stephanie Garber because it feels like, well, because I was doing a little bit of like reading about Stephanie Garber, like there's not much info I could find. I think somewhere I read that she didn't even mean for it to be about romance, and that I think is almost to her detriment, because I felt like she saw how crazy readers were going over these couples that she was writing, and she realized that actually she could be rewarded for withholding from her readers. And I think because she withheld so much of Jack's, she could get this whole new series written. But now she's taken that too far, where readers are turning against her because she's sort of like playing with what the reader wants too much. This was meant to be a duology, and then it was turned into a trilogy. And I think it could have actually been very successful as a duology, but she instead chose to make it even longer, and as I keep saying, chose to sort of to draw out this union between Evangeline and Jax, because she knew that's what would get people to read and buy the books. And now she knows that if she withholds the information about Jack's backstory and the apples and everything, she's going to get another series published where readers are then going to look for answers to that. I don't know, it just feels like a bit of a fuck you to the reader when you see it like that. I also just think this would have been much more successful if she kind of had been free from the reins of traditional romance, because that is sort of what she's breadcrumbing you to believe throughout the whole series, where it's drawing on so much of like this sort of feeling of it being a fairy tale, and she explicitly draws these parallels between Evangeline and Jax and the Ballad of the Archer and the Fox. And like, if she'd actually stuck to those parallels and had made it a tragic ending, I think that would have been maybe not more successful, but just like more true to the story that it felt like she was trying to tell, or just more compelling. But instead it's this weird book where it's like ostensibly about a girl falling in love with a villain, right? And then instead of giving us 2 good books about that, what she's chosen to do is to write 3 books where one of them is completely contrived, and instead of Jax being the villain, he suddenly becomes the good guy, and Apollo, for no apparent reason that I can see, even though we get his whole point of view, is the villain instead. And it just feels like she was too afraid to just go as hard as she could have gone. Like, she could have gone so hard, and she simply chose not to. In essence, what I'm trying to say is that I think Stephanie Garber has been rewarded too much for fucking with her readers and for withholding the stuff that she knows they want, and we can't let it continue anymore, and I'm boycotting these books now.